Nixon was in Dallas that week. He flew out just hours before Kennedy flew in. But there's this competing narrative about George Herbert Walker Bush, both that he was in Dallas, that you fairly well document in the book Family of Secrets, and he says he can't remember where he was, and there seems to be all these sort of competing stories about where he was or what he was doing that day.
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly competing stories. I mean, they are to some degree, but essentially, if you line up all of these specific factors that I do not know have been successfully challenged by anyone or even challenged by anyone, they do, in fact, suggest that he would have every reason to remember exactly where he was, not just because he was there, but because he was 40 years old. He was himself a candidate for the United States Senate at the time in that state. He was a vocal critic of Kennedy. And then, as I hope we will get into, there are some government documents relating to specific things that he said and did that day.
Well, let's do that, because as it turns out, and I mentioned this last hour, he gets briefed after the assassination. Why, if he were running for the Senate and he were at that point just a successful businessman in Texas, why would he be being briefed by the CIA or Secret Service afterward?
Right. Well, basically, so we start with the fact that he has publicly stated he didn't remember where he was. I think he probably was hoping that question was never going to be asked, and it was asked sort of out of context. You know, this kind of random questions you do when you're doing a puffball interview of somebody.
Right.
Just kind of talking about, you know, your life and history and so on.
Where were you on 9/11, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so, you know, he's in a little bit of a bind because there's some information about where he was, but he can't say that. So what he does is he says, I don't remember. And, of course, that's not a great answer. And so we have a couple of interesting documents. One is a declassified document from the FBI, from J. Edgar Hoover, and it basically says that on November 23, the FBI was involved in a briefing relating to the Kennedy assassination, and particularly to right-wing anti-Castro Cuban exiles who we know have some strong interest in Kennedy after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. They considered him to be a traitor to their cause. And so this memo relates to them, and it mentions two representatives of other intelligence services who are participants in this briefing. One is from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he is named, and then there is George Bush of the CIA. And so there it is, right in that document that came out in the 1990s.
Yeah, and yet it's a document from 1963. And so it comes out years later, but it's specific to that day that George Bush was briefed, George Bush of the CIA. And yet in the timeline of the future president, he doesn't become CIA until 1976. Right, or 75, 76?
Beginning of 76, he takes office as CIA director.
So he takes office, and there was all this criticism about, well, why him? This is a political appointment. He has no background in intelligence. Well, yeah, maybe he had the best background in intelligence. He was such deep cover that very few people even knew about it, even within the CIA.
Well, that's exactly right, Ian. In fact, the way I work, the way I do my journalism is I try to go into everything with nothing but questions, and usually very general questions like, why did somebody say what they did? Why did they do what they did? Why did someone like George W. Bush become president of the United States, which is actually how I began the research for Family of Secrets. I had no idea what the answer would be, or if, in fact, if there even was a particularly interesting answer beyond what we already knew. With the JFK module, if you want to call it, of Family of Secrets, I was simply trying to answer why the elder Bush in the book, by the way, I refer to them, as you know, as Poppy and W, and that's not intended to be pejorative, but simply to distinguish two men with the same first and last name.
Sure.
And those are family nicknames. So anyway, the question was, why could Poppy Bush not remember where he was? And so Yes, you're right. In 1976, he becomes CIA director. It's important to remember that period was the only time in American history where the CIA was seriously questioned and scrutinized on Capitol Hill. There were major hearings going on, the most important ones, a committee run by Senator Frank Church, and they were looking at everything, and they were just shocked, and the American people were shocked by what they were finding, because this agency was completely unaccountable. It was out of control. It was involved in every manner of nefarious and illegal thing domestically and abroad, and only one part, but an important part, were these coups against elected officials in other countries and assassinations, and all these other programs with mind control research, MK Ultra, trying to use psychotropic drugs on people to see if they could get them to do things either unwittingly or against their will, and so forth. A lot of just amazing stuff you'd think would be out of fiction, and
sure.
so they were under all this scrutiny, and tremendously defensive. There was a real threat that the agency might be shut down or transformed from what we knew it to be. And so here's the agency, and who do they pick? They pick this man, this sort of kind of bumbling, not particularly effective communicator who didn't have much of a track record. He'd had a few posts doing this and that, but I mean, he really was not a heavyweight. He didn't seem to know anything about intelligence. And I went back and I read all these clippings from the time to see if there was an explanation, New York Times, Washington Post, why this man, and they didn't know. They just sort of said, well, who knows? He's a fresh face. Maybe they're trying to kind of clean up their act or something. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense. And so I went back, started looking, and I found all these indications that he seemed to have been involved with the agency before. In fact, not just in 1963, but as you know, because you've read the book, all the way back in 1953, with the beginning of his offshore oil company.
And I think this is, I guess it'd probably be a good time to break and give the synopsis that you presented to the publisher when you were pitching the book Family Secrets. How would you sum up, as condensed form as possible, the uniqueness of the Bush family in the way in which they intersect at so many important historical crossroads in our country and the major lives of the players in our country? They weave in and out of everything, and yet they do it in such a way as that you barely notice that they're there.
That's exactly right, Ian. In fact, I think, I'm trying to remember, when I pitched the book, I think one of my points was, here we were rushing out of the George W. Bush era, with many people saying, glad to be out of that, don't want to hear another word about the guy, let's move on. And I sort of thought, well, that's sort of interesting, because there were so many things that happened in the 8 years that W was president that were disturbing on so many different levels. Violations of civil liberties, domestic wiretapping, a war sold under misleading circumstances, strange appointments, the harassment and replacement of U.S. attorneys who didn't play ball. I mean, they're literally, we could fill the whole 2 or 3 hours just listing these things. And so I thought, so many strange things happen in this country. It seems to me a mistake to just kind of race on and say, let's just put this behind us. And I remembered how so many countries that had been traumatized had some kind of a period of reflection. Particularly in Latin America, where you had these truth commissions, where they couldn't have a national reconciliation without really studying what had happened. And I thought, our country just loves this kind of collective amnesia, and I'm not going to be party to that. I'm going to go back and look and see, is there anything that we can learn from this? And so that was sort of my pitch. What could we learn? And how I had gone in without any agenda or any particular expectations. Really, that 2 years, I worked on this for 5, almost 6 years in some senses, but let's say 5 years. And the first 2 years, I kind of didn't find anything that was super interesting. And then suddenly looking at a few key factors, including this not remembering where H.W. Poppy was in 1963, I kind of went down this rabbit's hole, and I said, oh, my God. And it was sort of terrifying, because, I'm pretty much what you call a mainstream journalist, I guess, perhaps on the margins of mainstream. But, I write for all these, so-called respectable publications. I've been published not just in the United States, but in the top newspapers and magazines all over the world. And I've worked for everybody from, The Nation on the liberal end to Fox News television and so forth. And so I thought, gee, this stuff is so bizarre and disturbing and even terrifying. And I would show what I was finding to friends and colleagues, people who'd won Pulitzer Prizes and things. And I said, look at this stuff and, tell me if I'm crazy, because I feel like I'm losing my mind. And people would just look at all this documented stuff, and then there'd be a long silence. And instead of telling me, don't do this because, you've lost it, they would tell me, literally, the quote would be, watch your back. And so I went, and once I sort of steeled myself, I went to the publisher and I said, this is just stuff that's going to change the way, if you really are willing to publish this and you're willing to get into this, it's going to change the way, not just that you viewed the last 8 years, the George W. Bush period, but it's going to change the way you view much of American history.
In this memo from 1963, it identifies that George Bush was briefed after the assassination of President Kennedy, and it said in the memo in 1963, George Bush of the CIA. I mean, that makes total sense now. We tie that all together, and it's like, oh, well, of course he was CIA.
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, there was one, there are a number of things we could have discussed also about the earlier evidence, but just one, I think, very useful one is documents showing that when Poppy Bush set up Zapata offshore, one of the people involved in it was this fellow Devine, who, according to these CIA documents, was a CIA officer. So, I mean, there it is. It mentions Bush, it mentions Devine, and it says Devine was an active duty CIA officer who, quote unquote, left the agency to start this thing. So there's that.
Right.
Now you're right. Now we flash forward to 1963, and here's this memo. And it mentions him, and of course, there's this little story there you may recall where when this comes out briefly in 1988, as
this is the best,
is on his way to being crowned as the Republican nominee for president. This is published. This article is published in The Nation magazine. It's completely ignored by the media, and it says, hey, there's this memo saying that he was in the CIA years before, and it's completely ignored. Now, how you could possibly ignore the notion that a man who was about to become the president of the United States may have had a secret life, when you think of all the interest in this rather, I think, dubious story about Obama's birth certificate, nobody was interested in the fact that the United States could have had the equivalent of Vladimir Putin, meaning somebody who, instead of being principally identified as what he was, a businessman, diplomat, and so on, was actually involved in this very, very compromised, controversial secret agency.
And let's be forthright about what happened when you looked into the story and you started a call to kind of figure out, okay, so who was the George Bush? If it wasn't George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the George Bush that was briefed in 1963? And this is the part where right away people start playing, it seems like kind of like pussyfoot with the truth, including the guy they end up trying to prop up as the person that was the one who was in the memo.
Yes, in fact, the story I'm about to tell is itself proof of a larger operation going on in 1963. The CIA in 1988, when this comes out, says when this reporter Joe McBride contacts them and says, "Hey, how do you explain this document?" They say, "We never confirm or deny personnel," which is correct. They never say yes or no. Somebody did work for us. That's the correct stance. But there's so much potential issue here for Bush as he's preparing to be president that the agency does something they never do. They suddenly come back. I think the AP or somebody calls them and they say, "Oh, no, that was another George Bush." Well, that right away is completely improper. And so that showed that the stakes were very, very high. And they say there was another guy with that name who worked for us, but so when asked, well, where is he? We'd like to talk to him. They say, well, we don't know where he is anymore, which is
right. The CIA does not know where a guy named George Bush was who used to work for them.
Right. Well, it turned out McBride had no problem finding him. He was working for the Social Security Administration by the time he got to him. And he talked to this man, and he said, here's this memo, and he showed it to him and so on. And the guy said, that can't be me. He said, look, I was just hired in that period in the fall of 63 as a trainee. He basically was approached and offered a chance to try out, and he said, fine. He had a very low-level position. He didn't have any involvement with any kind of briefings or anything at all like that. And he left the agency, I believe, shortly after this whole period of events. And so one looks at that and they say, my gosh, this almost looks like this guy was hired because they wanted to have that name, that there was another George Bush in there
right.
at that sensitive point.
It seems crazy to think that there could be another George Bush other than George Herbert Walker Bush. But as you already hear, Russ Baker essentially proves that he was in Dallas. We might make the assumption in Dealey Plaza for the day of the JFK assassination, and at the middle of so many other major stories like Watergate and other things we'll get to coming up. And we haven't even gotten to W yet. And then oddly enough, of course, he's back in the picture again under Reagan. And Reagan at first resisted the idea of having George Herbert Walker Bush as his running mate. We all know that Reagan had open antipathy and talked about that sort of skull and bones crowd, that trilateral commission crowd. He didn't like that.
That's right. Reagan was basically forced to put Bush on his ticket. You see, what it looks like is that certain elements within this community, including people in the CIA. Now, I'm not talking about the whole agency because it's full of very loyal, patriotic Americans who are excellent at their jobs, and they don't know about any of this stuff. So you're just talking about a very small circle of people, okay? But what they're doing is they're saying, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. You know, Kennedy, it looks like he was taken out in the worst possible manner, and I think once they saw that people would never stop talking about this thing, well, they learned that you can't do it that way. Richard Nixon was taken out another way, very, very complicated, but he was taken out. And as I point out in Family of Secrets, Jimmy Carter was basically taken out. He was kept to one term. A very interesting story about the scandals around his close friend and confidant, Bert Lance.
Right.
CIA-connected banks. And frankly, I'll tell you something. I am now discovering that there are stories relating to things that happened to Bill Clinton that nearly that destabilized his government. And I think what we're looking at is a very a sensitive and fragile situation that perpetuates to the present day. In fact, in Family of Secrets, I quote a former high-ranking Republican official who said to me, why are you surprised? He said, the CIA has put people into every part of the government, and the people around them don't even know. There are all these people put into the White House to keep an eye on the president. And then I discovered that a former high-ranking official had been tasked by Allen Dulles back in the 1950s to use military cover. That's how they did it. They put people in as these so-called, military attachés in all of these departments. So we've got a real problem on our hands. I think it still exists to the present day. I think Barack Obama, wittingly or unwittingly, is right in the middle of this thing. And Ian, that's why I founded this nonprofit, nonpartisan website, whowhatwhy.com.
Right.
Where what I'm trying to do is to do journalism now and in the future about what's going on and to kind of explore these deeper currents behind the surface events that we get distracted by. We spend all our time on. We want to look at these things, get it out of the corporate media and have it be entirely a publicly funded thing, and look into these kind of things, both the historical things and the current things, because it seems to be on a continuum.
Well, and again, that goes back to why this is not either Republican or Democratic. This is about people who are controlling the money and who secretly own the power, and they don't want to run for office. They just want the people that they control to run for office so that they can effectively change things to bring back to them a more profitable situation both in this country and around the world.
That's exactly right. In fact, if you look at the policies, you mentioned this at the beginning of the show, the Obama policies, and you say, well, this guy is, or at least presented himself as a reformer, and yet things seem to be the same on many, many issues, certainly as far as Iraq and Afghanistan. The range of options that he seems to have are so narrow. On the economy, basically a continuity, Bernanke, and then bringing in people like Summers and Geithner, who are so tight with the J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan, Goldman Sachs, on and on and on. It just seems like with all these possibilities in the world, nothing is considered except a very, very narrow sliver that is acceptable to the exact same people that have always been, driving things.
And I'm open to the idea of seeing that President Obama can do it differently, but I would say so far, much to the chagrin, especially to many of the people that elected him, it's the same meat, different gravy.
Right, but the point I'm making is it may not be, and again, this is just conjecture, it may not be that he's just the same as these other people. It may be that he simply doesn't have the range of movement. If, in fact, all of these things I document in Family of Secrets are correct, and they're all factual, and they're all footnoted and with the documents, then he really just can't do anything about this.
Right. Well, maybe. Maybe he's muscle-bound. Maybe he's constricted, and maybe he sees in the long run, maybe there's already been some sort of, he can already see the writing on the wall of what will happen in 2012 if he plays ball. And I know that sounds really cynical, but after reading Family Secrets, I'm sorry, dude, I come back to thinking there are just a lot of people out there that know where all the bodies are buried. They know how to manipulate people. They know how to get what they want, and it doesn't matter to them whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the office. They simply just go on business as usual. Family of Secrets about the Bush dynasty and then about America's invisible government. Gordon, it's open lines. Where are you going to take us?
Hi, I'm calling to tell you about the GMan Entity, so me and a colleague call it.
Okay.
It is, first, what it looks like is it's a tall, middle-aged man dressed in a blue suit wearing holding a black briefcase, and his skin is very pale, and he has very black, close-cropped hair. And he has very green eyes, and I've never seen him up close. But the thing about him is that I've seen him, for example, in my lab across the way, and when I go to that area, he disappears. And the most weird thing is, if he's on the other side of a door that has glass on a glass window, he'd lock the door, so I have to go the long way around into the room, and he's not even there. Only me and my colleague have seen him in our lab.
What do you do in your lab?
We deal with theoretical physics. That's pretty much all I can tell you.
What do you mean, why can't you tell me more?
Very secret research, and that's what I think he might be there for. We call him the G-Man because we thought he might be with the government, but he seems to be more like a phantom.
Well, if he's with the government, would he be with the Canadian government, or do you think he's with the U.S. government?
Oh, we're working with the United States.
Okay, so...
We don't know who he's with. We just thought at first, but we see him more and more, and nobody else seen him. We kept asking around about his description, but nobody else has seen him.
Have you thought about trying to capture him on film?
Oh, yes, but we never had the chance. I mean, we never know when he's going to come along.
All right, well, it's a great story. Keep us up to date. Feel free to email the G-Man appearance in Gordon's secret lab.
Hey,
This is our first podcasted show, so you're recorded for posterity tonight.
Fantabulous.
Glad to have you. Where are you going to take us?
Well, you brought up the Clintons, and let me just say, I don't know if there should be any due respect to the Clintons, but every time I hear their name, I can't help think of Waco, The Rules of Engagement, a documentary video. Have you ever seen that on?
I saw it.
What did you come away from that video?
Well,
what did you...
Yeah, I saw it, and I tried to keep an open mind in it. I mean, I have a different perspective. And when it comes to Waco, I will tell you that part of my lens on Waco will always be from my experiences with what they call millenarian movements, people that believe religiously that they can bring about end times or that they are participating in end times. And it tends to, apocalyptic movements tend to create their own end times. And David Koresh was typical of a millenarian movement leader. His power came from this sort of supernatural role that he imagined for himself in the end of time. And so, do I see abuses by the Justice Department, certainly by the ATF, where they overplayed their hand originally to try to bring in David Koresh? Oh, yeah. Were there lots of good reasons for the Justice Department to investigate what they did wrong? And, yeah, I don't see it from the perspective of the filmmakers who believe that that Janet Reno went in there with tanks that had flamethrowers on the end of it. I don't see that. And
Ian, what they did do, and I saw the video half a dozen times. Right. Okay. Koresh had been investigated by the sheriff. All the law enforcement agencies had investigated that whole so-called compound and its inhabitants. They hadn't violated any so-called laws. Okay. There were no violations, none whatsoever. And it became evident from the testimony of the people in ATF who had a conscience that, and others, the lawyers, right, that this whole thing was a gross miscarriage. There was this was totally unjust.
They picked a fight with David Koresh. There's no doubt about it.
But let me say this.
They totally picked a fight with David. But the thing is, Koresh didn't have to fight back. And
they were fired upon. They were invaded by an army, and that is a violation of posse comitatus. Everything that went down there, the government violated their own so-called laws.
Well,
it was genocide.
Let's just for the purposes of this conversation, just so we know, I mean, it feels like at first you were asking what my opinion was, and I'm happy to express it. If you just want to express your opinion on that, go ahead, and let's then just move on. But I just have to tell you, I saw that video. I don't think that the claims of the producers end up having validity, that they had flamethrowers with, attached to the tanks. I don't think that happened.
No. What they did have was CS gas.
I don't think they did.
People, and then they burned them to a crisp.
I don't think that was their intent.
And they shot.
I don't think it was their intent to do that.
People who were attempting to flee.
I don't think it was their intent to do that. And I don't think. And there was. Wait, hold on. There's a lot of room to say what the ATF did was wrong. How the government overreacted was criminal, you could even say.
Well, you're right. The Federal Bureau of Insanity is a big-time violator.
Let's just agree then to disagree on the rest of this. But I will say to you again, with David Koresh, with figures like him, that was at some point inevitable. The history.
Wait. Why was that inevitable? The guy all he was doing was speaking.
No, hold on. All of his theology and all of his control over his group was based on the idea that he was a supernatural figure.
Those people were there because they were following the leader that they chose to follow for their own personal reasons. They weren't forced into that.
I didn't say they were. But there are many people who say that they were not allowed to leave. And
that's a damn lie.
Okay. You know what? I think we've reached an impasse. I don't think you were really interested in a conversation. I think you're interested in kind of a conversion. And you will not convert me to that belief. There is a lot of evidence to say that you're wrong on that. It's not a lie. It is a difference of opinion. I think if you really looked at David Koresh and the history of people doing what he did, they always end in showdowns. Always ends in a showdown with somebody. That's where the power comes from. It has to end in a showdown. Now, the government totally stepped in it, picked a fight, it was dumb and it was horrible. But there was also a part of this that David Koresh, if David Koresh let all those people go, or if David Koresh truly let his followers experience free will or encouraged them to go be safe and go be free, if he had done that, there would not have been the loss of life that there was at Waco. He still has a part of that. And I'll always believe that from what I've studied of it. And I've studied of it. And I've looked at that video. I would encourage you to look at other material that might disagree with you. And I think it might alter your opinion a little bit.
I think one of the strangest things I can remember, Ian, that was stolen was there's a legend that when Jimi Hendrix died, that this was one of the conspiracy theories, that every apartment that he owned that was either in England or New York, that they were broken into before his death was announced and things were stolen. And one of the things that was stolen was supposedly the last great master tape that Hendrix had done. I think the album was called Black Gold or whatever. And this album was taken, and no one knows what happened to it. So this is a complete master that's part of the urban legend of something being taken from Hendrix. I know that when Brian Jones died, a lot of his material was taken out of the house and stolen. And when we're talking about Al Cooper, Al Cooper also owned a Jimi Hendrix Stratocaster. And he was so terrified leaving the guitar in his house because those guitars are extremely valuable, because what they have to do is they have to trace the serial number from Manny's in New York to say that Hendrix actually owned it. So he just eventually sold it to a Japanese collector, and I think it's known as the Jimi Hendrix Al Cooper Stratocaster now. But, I mean, some of the stuff is so valuable that, you have to be very careful where you keep it.
Right. You can freak out with that stuff. I can totally get that.
So many interesting stories I'm going to share with you now. This one comes from Kelly in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who writes, in 1968, my dad was in Vietnam and my mom was living in Monroe, Louisiana. One night, my mother got up because she heard crying from her daughter, Susan. Before she entered the room, Mom realized that Susan was praying, and she stood at the door listening. Apparently, Susan had dreamt that our dad had died in Vietnam and was praying for God to take her instead of him. Sometime during the next few months, there was a show on television about how funeral homes sometimes rip people off, and my sister told my mother to bury her in a plain coffin. Mom, of course, told her she didn't need to worry about such things at her young age. That May, however, Susan drowned in a bayou. Apparently, she'd swum out to get something that someone had dropped off of a boat. She was just that kind of a person. The speculation was that the motor on the boat started too soon and the undertow of the water caught her. It took 3 days to find her because they weren't expecting to find her in 3 feet of water. Because of these sad events, my father was given leave from his tour of duty and sent home for the funeral. During the time he was home, I was conceived. We all believe that if it hadn't been for my sister's premonition and loving heart, Dad wouldn't have had the next 20 years of his life, and I wouldn't have been born. I just wanted to share that with you because if you're interested in the subject on last night's show, I hope you find it as inspirational, sad, and beautiful as I do. Kelly, Tulsa. Thank you. Ian, I was unable to call in last night, but I have 3 stories. Late 1970s. I was 16 and had a 15-year-old friend. He told all his friends he would not live to see 16. Few months later, he and another friend pulling the bullets out of .22 caliber shells and firing them at each other, and a sliver of a bullet remained in the casing and went into his heart, killing him. Early 1980s, a 24-year-old woman was a girlfriend of a roommate. She came home from a mission for the LDS Church. I took her out to lunch, asked about her future plans. She told me she had made none since she felt like she had fulfilled them all. 2 weeks later, she died in an automobile accident. She told my roommate the same thing. Early 1990s, I'm an over-the-road truck driver. I'm driving through PA on I-80. I start smelling Old Spice cologne in my truck. I glance in my right-hand mirror, and my grandfather is sitting in the passenger seat. He smiles at me. I stop and call my sister to find out that my grandfather has passed away a few minutes before I saw him in my truck. He used Old Spice as a cologne for years. Thought you might like these. Mark, Ravenna, Ohio. From Rita in California, Ian, I'm catching the replay. My brother had a premonition back on November 14th, 1985. My brother called me. He had what we call in our family a feeling of impending doom. He was living in Dallas. Mom lived in San Francisco. I lived in Palisades, New York. He thought he was feeling something about my mother and her dying. He had this sensation for several days, and he was calling me almost daily about it. This kind of thing wasn't unusual for us, and it was usually on target, but I didn't want him dwelling on it or stressing our mother out. After about an hour, he said, "You're right. For all I know, it could just be me." Within 6 hours of saying that, he was dead. He was shot in the back as he was walking home by a paroled murderer. He was only 34. Karen writes this, "Sad to say, I never took Ross seriously. Just 1 year before his death, he began saying things about dying. He was only 54 when he started on this. His father had lived to 90, so I dismissed him. He would say things like, 'Your dad died young. My dad died at 55, so did Ross.' I picked up a book to save the new commemorative quarters." Right? Remember when they all came out? You got those cardboard books where you put the quarters in? He said, "I won't live long enough to see all the quarters." I said, "Ross, what are you talking about?" He died of a brain aneurysm. December that year. I will never dismiss anybody that tells me they don't think they're going to live long again. Karen.
I guess it was several months ago, and this has to involve in Nashville, too, so it's near to our heart, I'm sure, Ian. But I was talking to a lady who is a real estate agent, and she had purchased a condo that had been owned by Elvis Presley. Now, this is interesting. And she didn't know it at first, and it was in the 70s, probably 79, 80 when she bought it, maybe a little later, maybe in the middle 80s. But she said when she walked into the condo, it had a sunken living room, and she said, "Well, that's real 70s." And then she saw shag carpet on the floor, which looked all right.
Very 70s, right?
Yes, but then it had shag carpet on the walls, and you got it shag carpet on the ceilings. And she said, "This has got to go." So she did. She looked around into the bedrooms. In one of the bedrooms, there was a closet, and there were steel bars on a window that went into the closet, and she was told that's where the band kept their instruments. And then she went into the other bedroom, which was much larger, and there was a stage set up with live PA equipment that was very old, that was still hooked up, and she realized that this is where they practice, and this was a party place. So she decided, I've got to take out all the equipment. So she takes out the mixer, she takes out the microphones, and gives them away, which she probably should have kept. But
yeah, really.
And then she hired some contractors to come in and rip out the shag carpeting, which they did. And she noticed that the workers kept feeling very strange, some presence or whatever. And every time they locked the door, when she came in, the door was unlocked. So she would lock it. They would come in. The door was unlocked. They put the garage down, the garage door. When they came in, the door was up. And so she was jumping on them, and they said, "No, we're locking it." And so she said, "Well, something strange is going on here." So she has a friend who has psychic abilities and came over, and she said that she felt a presence of a male in this room. And she said, "Oh, my goodness, what's this?" So she had heard the legends that Elvis Presley had owned this condo, this particular one, when he was in Nashville to record.
Because it makes sense, because he spent a lot of time in Nashville recording.
And from what I was told, it was in the name of, was it J.D. Sumner, the bass singer in his backup band?
J.D. Sumner
his name.
And the Stamps.
That's it. And so she went to the man who built the condos, and it turned out that he went to her church. And she asked him about the condo number, and he says, "Well, that's true. Elvis did own that." And he said, one time he would keep a white limo outside, and he would take people to grocery stores or whatever. He said, "I personally rode with him one rainy night." But she said somebody had some sort of episode there, somebody whose health was in danger, and they had to take him to the hospital. So one night she's laying around watching television after she had ripped out all the shag carpet, and she said that as she was watching it, and this is kind of interesting, as one of the Elvis greatest hits collections comes on television, and she noticed this eerie presence, and it looked like a young guy standing next to the set, and he had this look of sadness on his face. And then he just sort of disappeared. So now she had to get to the story. So, she said, "I didn't feel threatened," but she went to Memphis. And there's a place in Memphis, I think they call it the Pink Palace, and this was set up as a museum. And she walked in, she said there was a picture. And Well, a picture of Elvis in his Army uniform, and standing next to it was this a mannequin with a uniform on it. She said, I swear, it was the same person. So she said, oh, my gosh, this is Elvis somewhere, how he looked in 56 or 57. So she goes back and she talks to her friend again. She comes back over and they try to contact the spirit. Nothing happens. But she said, I still don't feel it's threatening. So how the story ends is she was sitting there one night and she could turn to the side and she saw this presence. So she closed her eyes and she said, all right, you can leave now. You don't need to be here. We're going to take care of everything. When she opened her eyes, it was gone. And she sold the condo, but that's the first ghost story I've heard with Elvis Presley, and it's in Nashville at this condo complex.
I'll be darned.
So if you live in Nashville in a condo, you may have a visitor.
You know, if you really want to find out whether it's Elvis and you see that apparition there in your room, just turn on your television to any show that has Robert Goulet in it.
Then you'll be gunshots into the screen. You got it, Ian.
And then just see what Elvis does. if your TV explodes,
it's Elvis.
It was really Elvis. I used to love the stories that I was friendly with Elvis's step brothers, his step little brothers, the Stanley brothers. And Billy Stanley was telling me about how they used to float the light bulbs, like the Sylvania blue dot bulbs and stuff. Yeah. Used to float them in the pool in Memphis, and then Elvis would shoot at the light bulbs. That is money. That is money. That's the definition to me of money to burn.
That's it.
Just doing that on a night and then having to drain the whole pool, clean it all out, put the water back in, and do it all over again a week later.
Robert is in L.A. on Coast to Coast AM. Robert?
Yeah, you got me.
All right, so where are you going to take us?
Oh, my God, places you don't want to
go. Well, I'll take that challenge.
Try to hold on to your seat real tight now. Okay, this is going to start at the very beginning. Now, Americans aren't that stupid. They know what's going on. I walk around the street and I talk to people at random, and they tell me they know they're being ripped off with the oil shortage. They know they're being scammed, and they know where it's coming from. And if you look back at the very beginning, when they're recounting the election and they're recounting all that was going on, and then we had the energy shortage, Enron, if you remember that. Well, remember when Enron happened and we had a governor named Gray Davis in California? And remember, Gray Davis filed a $30 billion, that's $30 billion as in billion-dollar lawsuit? Who did he file that lawsuit against? Who do you think?
Barack Obama?
No. No. The Vice President of the United States. Oh. And then after that lawsuit was filed, guess who visited the White House? That would be Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then what did we have? We had a recall, and Gray Davis was removed, and his lawsuit ended. Isn't that mysterious?
Well, yeah, I mean, but that was the voters of California, right, that voted for the recall. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I know, but, not to say Gray Davis is all that great of a superhero, but it was sort of funny when he took on Bush administration for the whole energy debacle here in California and the $30 billion of missing money, the Democratic Party went, oh, my God, this guy's got cojones. They said, we want you to be president. They're actually saying, hey, we want you to run for president if you're that crazy. But, where's he now? He's probably, working in a 99-cent store in L.A. or something.
He's probably repeating to himself, I was right. I mean, we know now, obviously, Enron was running a scam on the state of California. Maybe he had the right idea. He just had the wrong, defendant in that lawsuit. And Robert, I appreciate that. I do think there's no coincidence that Schwarzenegger visited the White House. He had to get the blessing to run for the vacated post. But I think Schwarzenegger's done a really interesting job, much better than I would have anticipated he would have done. And I do think that the question of citizenship will come up again someday. A lot of people would like to see Schwarzenegger run for president. And there is a larger question of whether or not this whole constitutional prohibition on people born outside of the country is really relevant anymore. I mean, it was relevant in the very early years of this country when there was a fear that somebody was going to come in and hijack the country back, and hand over the keys to England or whatever. But is that, if somebody naturalizes a citizen at age 1, is there really any point to preventing them from becoming president, or even in the case of Schwarzenegger, who comes over as a young adult? I don't know. The Democrats and Republicans.
Well, I have a story about when I lived up in Forest City, up around this area. I was living in a house, and I didn't find out everyone else already picked rooms in this house, a bunch of other football guys, and I moved down to the basement because it's the only room left.
Right.
And I found out that about 5-6 months before, some guy committed suicide in that room.
Yikes.
So when I move in there, there's still some blood on the walls and stuff like that, so I made sure to wash it all off and everything, and then we decided to renovate it and put a bar in down there. And I was sleeping, or trying to sleep one night. I didn't get to sleep, and I closed my eyes just trying to make myself fall asleep, and I just felt like something really weird come over me, and I go and I look, and I just knew I shouldn't, but did anyway, and I look over there, and this it was like black and white, but it had red eyes, and it was just looking right at me and said my name, and scared the crap out of me. And I
bet.
I yelled no or whatever. And
black and white what?
It was like it was very discernible. Like you could tell that it was a human like form. It looked like an old guy is what it looked like. Had a beard and just like kind of balding and
where did the black and white thing come into it?
Well, it had no color. Like it was like
oh, I see.
Looking like a black and white photo is what I meant.
Right. I totally get it. So like an old movie or something off a black and white TV show or something.
Yeah, is what
against a color background, but he was not chromatic or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
But his eyes were just red, and I yelled no, and I kind of curled back up, hid under the blanket like a little kid.
And what did he say to you?
He just said my name. Just said JT, and that freaked me out quite a bit.
I bet. Okay, and you weren't drinking that night?
No, I wasn't drinking because during season, I never drank or anything.
Right. Or so you told the coach, anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Now, so did but nobody else has reported seeing that old guy? And was there any tie-in with the kid who had committed suicide down there?
It was an old man that committed suicide.
Oh,
he was
never mind.
He had cancer, and he was terminal, and he just did it to kind of.
Yikes.
He shot himself because I was taking a few criminology classes up there, and I talked to the guy that found the body in there, and he said he shot himself down there, and because he was terminal and he was suffering, so kind of just did that to himself. And a lot of other people, when they were alone in the house, is when they, whether they're convincing themselves that something was going on or whether something actually was.
Well, I love to tell this story, so I'll tell you again briefly, but it's my favorite Iowa ghost story. When I lived in Iowa, I worked for a rock station there in the Quad Cities called 97X.
Okay, I know that. And
it was built into as I came to work for. Now I believe the show, by the way, is carried by the lovely WOC, and we're happy to be on them. But when I worked there, it was in a former funeral home. They had taken the station, and this funeral home had moved out to the newer part of town and left behind this old mansion, which was a really cool, like built to be a funeral home mansion. And they and in that mansion, they couldn't find anybody who would buy it because it was still a funeral home. And so this radio station came along, offered them, I think I heard like a song for it, moved in the radio station into this mansion, and it became like the coolest place to work because it was a great physical plant for a radio station. But it was still, probably about a third of it was still unrenovated from when it was a funeral home. So you would be in certain parts and it would look totally like a radio station. You'd go up one flight of stairs, or you would take a weird turn, and suddenly, boom, you were very much confronted with the fact that this was a former funeral home. So the cool thing about it was, at least for me, is the elevators were haunted.
Okay.
And I know this will sound crazy, but they had body elevators, and they would use this elevator and this. It was only 2 stories, but had a deep basement, and the basement was where they kept the caskets. So this was a fairly industrial elevator for a building of its type. It may be even hard to imagine but it had to be big to bring the caskets up, and that elevator would routinely fire off on its own. They had inspected it 15 different ways. They were trying to figure out, and it would go off. It would suddenly just go down, and it would just go down to the basement as though it were getting a casket, and then go up to the second story where they used to hold the wakes and stuff. It used to freak out the overnight guys so much. that when he would come in, he would come in at like 7 o'clock for a 5-hour shift. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't leave the studio until the midnight to 5 a.m. guy came in, and he would only then would he leave, because it just had all this stuff. He would hear voices and see stuff, and it was a lot of fun. And I actually saw one or two things too, but we'll leave it at that for now. Thanks for sharing that, Justin. Enjoyed talking with you.